Good afternoon, everybody. Thanks for making it back from a very frugal lunch. I propose we get going pretty quickly because we've got an hour and there's a lot going on. Pundits, professors, and predictions. You can work out who the professors are, who the pundits are, and maybe if you've got a word beginning with P which you can add, I'd like to hear it at some point during the session. Inevitably, when this was first conceived, the idea was to think in the medium to long term, which probably is 2 to 4 weeks these days. But things have moved so fast in Egypt and Tunisia that we've decided to start on Egypt because of the implications for public policy, for governance, for governments around the world, for policy making, for the institutions of government in the Middle East, in North Africa, but of course how other governments like the United States, like in the European Union, like across the Gulf, and of course into Asia, how they respond. So there are massive strategic and long-term questions to answer, and that's what we propose to do in the first maybe half, maybe 20 minutes, maybe 30 minutes, and then morph it into the economic challenges, the financial challenges as well. Fareed Zakaria couldn't join us, but we have expanded the panel a little bit with Lord Mark Malloch-Brown, who is now in private business, Chairman of Global Affairs for FTI Consulting, based in Britain. Of course, he was with the Forum until this time last year. He was with the Forum, and before that was Minister of State at the British Foreign Office. And David Ignatius has joined us as well from the Washington Post, Associate Editor and columnist, and of course prolific, understands so many of these critical issues. Joining David Lee, thank you very much for being with us to discuss economic issues, and Kishore Mahbubane, who is from Singapore, Dean of the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy, again underlining the public policy elements to some of these other areas we want to get into. Martin Wolf, Associate Editor and Chief Economics Commentator of the Financial Times, also involved in the Banking Commission in Britain. And finally, Ernesto Zedillo Ponce de Leon, who is now at Yale, the Center for the Study of Globalization. So we're going to have to think the immediate, but with the implications for the future, which could be a few days, a few weeks, a few months, or even longer. Create whichever timeline you want for the way to frame our discussion over the next 55 minutes. All of you will probably have your BlackBerries or HTCs or iPhones or whatever. If anyone sees something coming from Egypt which you think should be injected into the discussion, please tell us, because everyone's been asking in the green room beforehand, what is the latest? And it seems to be a kind of standoff at the moment, but with the military on the streets, but many of the armoured personnel carriers now in the hands of the protesters, but raising enormous questions about what are we seeing on the streets, where is the power coming from, what are the implications of what we've seen, both in Cairo, in Alexandria, in Aswan, in Suez, and Tunis just a few days ago, and Yemen as well. Let me kick off, I think, Mark Malloch-Brown, because you can, I think, bridge between the policymakers and the strategic thinkers because of your time. If you were still in King Charles Street at the Foreign Office in Britain, what kind of assessments would you be making and offering to your Foreign Secretary and maybe your Prime Minister about what this means in terms of medium to long-term thinking?
Well, having spoken to some British experts on Egypt at the beginning of the week, the kind of people who are advising government, my impression is that their advice has done a complete turnover during the course of the week, because as recently as Monday, the expert orthodoxy was not likely really to be Egypt next. That's a bit of a press scare story. It's a much bigger country. It's a much more sophisticated country than Tunisia, with a much bigger middle class. It's had a much freer press for longer. By Friday, those strengths had been turned on their head. And the fact that it is an internet-connected society, does have a broad middle class, means that a phenomenon of protest has not just been transferred from Tunisia, but has taken a very deep, it seems, Egypt form and character. But it is one which is clearly driven by the electronic communications tools available to Egypt, which has in recent years tried to combine a kind of very limited political space with a much bigger social space underpinned by a very widespread access to electronic media. That appears to have become the Achilles heel of the regime.
And the implications now for others?
To me again? Well, I think, again at the beginning of the week, it seemed that it wasn't really the copycat cases which one should be looking at. It seemed more Lebanon, which has a very particular dynamic of its own, where, there was likely to be a next regime or government to come under pressure. But, if Egypt goes, then you do have to ask about the other countries of the Maghreb and their stability. You do have to ask about Middle Eastern countries such as Jordan, because, many of the same factors, and indeed Syria, many of the same factors are in play.
David Ignatius.
Well, to start with Egypt, at any time over the roughly 30 years that I've been visiting Egypt and writing about it, people in Western capitals have worried about the instability of an autocratic Egyptian regime. I was in Egypt at the time of the assassination of Anwar Sadat when Hosni Mubarak first came into power. At that time, there was a fear of the Egyptian street, as it was always called, this public that was angry, felt unrepresented in government. It's fascinating to see that in this internet age, what is not a new fear about the public's reaction to an unrepresentative, undemocratic government has new power, and that in the space of a week, as Mark says, we've gone from the likelihood that Mubarak would ride it out to, I would say, as of today, as an observer of this, I would say the likelihood that Mubarak will not ride it out. The fact that the United States, through Secretary Clinton and President Obama, have essentially stood their distance from Mubarak, urged him to reform, told him not to take the decisive military steps that would be necessary to crush this revolt, tell me that he's on the way out. But I think a fascinating question is the why now question, and the way in which the technology itself is an accelerator of change. When Egyptians gathered this street this week in Tahrir Square, Liberation Square, is named for the revolution of Nasser. In those days, the technology that had a transforming power was radio. And there's a generation of Arabs who grew up listening to the voice of the Arabs, as it was called. It was broadcast from Cairo with Nasser's spellbinding voice. People remember listening the way Americans remember listening to Franklin Roosevelt, the voice of Nasser calling for change. And in that era as this, that had a powerful effect. It's just now so much faster. It took the whole decade of the 1950s for Nasser's revolution to play through Syria, Lebanon, and the other countries. Now we talk about events happening in a week.
Publicist, could we have the lights up a little bit so we can see who else is in the audience who might want to contribute to our discussion, so it's a little less gloomy down there? That's better. Thank you very much indeed. Let's try and broaden this to the public policy implications. We were asked to talk about a regional security crisis. How big is a region now? This region now potentially goes around the world in terms of the implications for governance and public policy. Ernesto, what would you be saying now in your centre in Yale about the vulnerability of power to politicians, to civil servants, and to others who will have that power in future? What have they got to watch out for? What are we learning now in the last 2 weeks specifically?
Well, I would talk to them, but also to you and people like here, to say, well, first, be prudent. Second, let's try to be better informed about what's going on in Egypt. We don't really know what kind of event this is. We don't really know how the president is thinking about that. Perhaps the best thing that we can do now is to think about the best scenario that can be unfolded from this situation. And I think the best scenario is, number one, that the government becomes very careful about how to handle these public demonstrations, avoiding at all cost violence. Second, that the government I would say it's important that, at least for a while, stays in power and takes responsibility for managing whatever transition. I think it's a big mistake when people start saying, "Oh, this is the new democracy in Egypt being born." We don't really know whether that will be the outcome. So I think as analysts, as intellectuals, we should say we need a peaceful transition in Egypt, and perhaps it is not only the responsibility, but the only person that could decide, but I'm not sure whether he will be then enlightened, is Mubarak. So I would say, please calm down and don't start giving prescriptions to Egypt, particularly the large countries, because the double standard is very dangerous here.
What I'm trying to get at, though, Ernesto, is practitioners. Ultimately, governments are people, human beings who sit at desks on mobile phones, taking decisions based on good information.
Yeah, but who's taking the decisions? That's very important. And those who are taking the decisions away from Egypt should be very careful, because whatever you were talking about connectivity, David, and the problem is that if the President of the United States or the Chancellor of Germany or whatever says something, that will be known in the streets in Cairo, and that could tip a very delicate balance. And I think this problem is up for the Egyptians to solve it, to decide it, and it's up to them to build their new democracy. But let us hope that this is a peaceful democracy. And I'm saying this not as a Yale professor. I'm saying this as a person who happened to preside over a political transition which happened in my country, where for 70 years a party had been in power, and I have to give power to a person from a different party than mine. So I think it is the right way to do it. Take responsibility and try to manage this in a very orderly, peaceful transition. But please, foreigners should be very careful about how they talk and how they project their ideas and their policies towards Egypt, because that could be even more destabilizing than other problems that they are facing.
Please feel free to jump in on each other, to disagree or to build on the argument. But Kishore, can I come to you, Dean of the School of Public Policy? What kind of lessons are you beginning to draw for the vast number of people who come through your school, both from southern states, from eastern countries, from Western nations as well? This is about how you conduct public policy when the public is now feeling more empowered.
Well, I'm going to give somewhat a contradictory answer. On the one hand, there's no doubt that we are dealing with earth-shaking developments. I mean, if anybody had told us barely 2 months ago that the Tunisian government would be the first North African government to go down, we would have said no way, because Tunisia had been the most stable country in North Africa for the last 20, 30 years. But it's happened. So something profound has happened. And in the case of Egypt, frankly, I agree with Ernesto. Let's be careful, let's be cautious. We still do not know whether President Mubarak has left. He may or may not leave. Let's wait and see. But clearly something is shifting over there. But I want to echo, on the other hand, the note of caution that Ernesto just gave us, which is don't extrapolate this and say it's going to happen all over the world. Because there is actually a fundamental disconnect between the parts of the world that are doing very well, where the economies are growing 7, 8, 9%, and those where the economies are not growing. And in societies where the economies are growing, where people's standard of living is doubling every 6, 7 years, clearly there's a very different social and political dynamic in those societies. So I would say that most people in East Asia would say this will not happen in that region.
Are they being over-optimistic and complacent?
Actually, the paradox here is that actually they will not be complacent, because they do worry about this. But the lesson the ultimate lesson that all governments will learn from this, and I hope that they will learn from this, is that you've got to take care of your own people. And if you don't provide, if you keep your unemployment very high, And if you don't improve education, you don't improve healthcare, you don't improve urban transportation, you don't provide housing, this is what happens. And so the political pressure on governments to deliver results will become much stronger. And that's why I feel reasonably confident about most East Asian countries, with the exception of Myanmar, North Korea, and so on and so forth. Most of them, the economic growth is in fact gathering pace. And in fact, if you think in terms of predictions, I can confidently predict that, for example, that India and China will continue to grow 8 to 10%. And guess what? Southeast Asia is going to benefit enormously from Chinese and Indian growth. Southeast Asia is actually now going into one of its sweetest spots of history. Southeast Asia is about to enter a new era of golden economic growth. Egypt is not at the forefront of their minds now. So I think that's why you've got to disconnect events from one region and not apply them to other regions in the world.
Except one thing, one fact, Kishore. The Egyptian economy actually has been performing quite well over a number of years. Actually, Egypt has been one of the fastest growing economies in the world. You made a list of 10, Egypt will be there. So we have to be careful. I mean, they have very serious social problems, but they haven't had lack of economic growth in the last 10 years, and probably no lack of economic reform. The big mistake was that there has not been parallel movement in other important areas of their life.
I know, Martin and David, you want to come in a moment, but can I get a reality check from Mark? Because one of your previous jobs was as head of UN Development Programme, and you did the Arab Development Report, I think it was 2003, which signalled very clearly, and you got yourself into a lot of political trouble from many of the leaders in the region, for signalling, I remember you telling me at the time, privately, signalling what was likely to happen if the problem of unemployment, particularly among the younger generation, was not addressed. Again, I come back to the ability of those in power, the civil servants and those who are the politicians. Did they accept the inevitability of what you were warning about 8 years ago?
Well, there was a lot of resistance. I mean, the three things those reports are famous for having asserted was three gaps: women's rights, secular education and knowledge, and the democracy deficit. Now, in fairness, Egypt has done better on the first two of those than much of the region. It was only really on the third that there has not been movement. And as Ernesto has said, it's actually been quite successful in the years since then in terms of economic reform. I think one has to qualify that, Ernesto, by saying that I don't think they've overcome very high rates of inequality, and I think those may have even been exacerbated by what's happened. So I think there was always a willingness amongst intellectuals to accept this critique of the region, but a great reluctance amongst ruling groups, and indeed a closed-door ministerial Arab League condemnation of what had happened, where only a few brave people like Amra Musa saved my neck, I think, in terms of a real protest. But again, I think all of us feel a great discomfort in this room now of being too definitive about our predictions. I think Ernesto's words to us to try and understand what's going on, not be provocative from outside, press the principles of peaceful, inclusive change is the kind of thing we must do. We mustn't be the reckless pundits at Davos who assert too clearly the definitive direction that this is going.
But the calibre of people you were dealing with both then and when you were a Minister of State at the British Foreign Office, did they accept or understand even the almost inevitability of what might face them, as we're now seeing?
Yeah, look, again, you take Egypt. It's got, someone who would normally most years be here, Boutros Ghali, the finance minister, or the General Suleiman, who's in charge of security, or the Minister of Trade and Industry. Right? These are some of the ablest administrators and policymakers in the region. The difficulty is, they were all focused on working within a security state rather than a democratic state. And finally, that democracy deficit appears to have tripped up changes which we should acknowledge in other areas.
Well, that's what we're looking for, lessons. I can see several faces who might, and people in the audience who might, including a foreign minister, who might like to enter the discussion at this point. If you do, please, I can see one down there. So if you get the microphone. David, again, reflecting, and then we'll go to Martin and
Just
the other David.
A quick thought on this issue of economic growth and reform. There's no question that Egypt has worked hard to be a reforming Arab economy. The people that Mark cited, I think of the Minister Rashid, who comes to Davos every year, is just as good a public servant as I know in the Arab world. But analysts who look at Egypt would note that it's had a rate of growth roughly 5% over the last few years, which is fast enough to improve standards, raise expectations and hopes, but does not reach what I would describe as escape velocity. It doesn't get to that 8% level where you're actually out ahead of the growth of population. Egypt's population keeps growing so fast that at 5% growth, you don't quite keep up. And I think that's been the problem. And if we went around the region, we'd look at Jordan, at other economies where the population is growing faster even than reform-minded economic ministers can cope with. And it's sad. Yes, they did try the right things, but they didn't hit that India-China level where you break out.
David.
Well, I can't help but noticing that our session should be called practitioners. Practitioners, pundits, and professors, right? And being professor, I'm extremely cautious because we don't know what's really going on there right now. However, watching from distance, seems to me that three fundamental things maybe we can draw. Maybe, right? Number one, economic growth is not enough for achieving political stability, right? Because even with economic growth, if the expectations of the population, right, grow faster than the actual growth of income, people are becoming increasingly discontent. Number two, distribution is important. Aggregate number of GDP growth may not be that important. People on the street care about their own personal income growth. So distribution is important, not only income distribution, but also perhaps wealth distribution. Number three, public messages have to be listened very carefully by decision makers. Now, I say these three things because I tell you, my observation is that decision makers in China know this by heart. They know this better than scholars. It's often the time we economists in China arguing for our governments to push faster growth, to not so worry about distribution. However, they are warning scholars like me. Distribution are important. Inclusive growth is important. I salute our Indian colleagues in this annual meeting for emphasizing inclusive growth. And listening to public messages is also very important. Government officials in China have been working very hard in this regard. They have got trainings programs for listening and responding to public messages in the internet.
And President Hu and Prime Minister Wen have said that publicly, I think, on platforms, including at the World Economic Forum meetings. I've heard them. Martin, the linkage, economic growth, political capability, but also this pressure from, loosely, what we would call the street, whether in developing countries, emerging economies, or as well in the advanced economies. Look at the pressures in Greece.
I was actually thinking of the protests on the streets of London about the tuition fees. Perhaps our government will fall tomorrow. You heard it here first.
Hang on. I can't let you get away with that one. Why do you think that's even possible? Okay.
Because there is a certain tendency, which I think Ernesto is getting at, for people from developed countries to sound unbearably pompous and priggish in these circumstances. That's basically why I said that. I'm not predicting the collapse of the British government for that reason, though I can think of mechanisms which would break the Liberal Democrats, and that would membership of the coalition. But that's not what I want to go to. I'm just pointing out the protests from the street are not unique to this part of the world, or even to developing countries. I wanted to make 4 very, very quick points. The first is, I have to say, as an economist, very embarrassed for our quote-unquote profession by our performance over the last few years. It's quite nice to know, and Mark has brought this out, that people in international relations and politics are just as hopeless as we are at predicting anything. And that's brought out. And the second reason is, of course, that I suspect that if we did understand these things, and we don't, these are relatively low probability events, but they accumulate over the years. Over a sufficiently long time, they become very high probability, but the chances of it happening in any given year are low enough to ignore, and that's why we are constantly surprised. That's the second point I wanted to make. The third point, which I think goes back to de Tocqueville, who I consider the greatest analyst of politics who's ever lived, I think he made the remark, which is incredibly important and I think fits together these themes, which is that it's precisely when things get better and when liberalization begins that authoritarian regimes are at greatest risk. And I think that's completely consistent with our experience in recent decades, and surely the most shattering example of what we're seeing now, what we might be seeing now, namely the collapse of the Soviet Empire following the Gorbachev reforms. I think so we shouldn't, quote-unquote, be surprised in that sense. If it's true that Egypt has been doing a bit better, it's a bit more open, that it's now suddenly succumbed to this. The final point that was perhaps more relevant to my area of expertise, since everything else I've said is rather out of it, is what, I mean, of course this is potentially very politically momentous. I have no idea how momentous, and it would be foolish for me to pretend that I do have any real idea. But there is obviously this is Davos, so the question everybody is asking, well, what does it mean for the economy? Is this an economically, financially important event, or is it merely an important event in the history of the Arab world? And I've been thinking about this question, and I have two partial answers to this. The first, which is obviously if the Egyptian regime changes in a fundamental way, one can imagine changes in this regime and in neighboring regimes which destabilize the present relationships between these countries and Israel. And that would be potentially very significant. And I'd be interested in people's views of what that might mean. Remember, the Camp David Agreement was one of probably the only success the US has achieved in managing this area for 40 years. The second point I would make is, how far is it going to spread, and where? It's clear that if it were to spread, I'm not predicting this, it seems to me very unlikely, but what do I know? If it were to spread to the Gulf regimes, well, you're talking about simply the most important, just about the most important governments on earth. If it got into affected, or potentially affected world oil supply, we're talking about a major economic shock. Similarly, if it started to affect Pakistan. So there are clearly consequences of this which would not really be politically of the first order, but economically of the first order, but that does not apply, obviously, to what we're seeing so far.
Thanks, Martin. You've got the microphone. Please introduce yourself. We're still concentrating on the implications of Egypt and Tunisia, and we'll try and broaden out shortly. Anyone else who'd like to speak about this and the strategic implications and what we should be thinking about in terms of future analysis, please?
My name is Gamal Shaheen. I'm Egyptian. Of course, I live in London. But to Mr. Wolf, he's just asking about what will be happen if there is a change in the regime in Egypt. I would like to confirm everything in Egypt will be the same. The Muslim Brotherhood is didn't popular enough in the street. He didn't have the same credibility like Mubarak. But the issue is they are more organized than the National Democratic Party and the government. The problem in Egypt is it is not about democracy, or we didn't trust the democracy like Mr. Brown said. I think Mr. Rashid and Ghali, I know him, they believe in democracy, but there is a lack of trust between the Egyptian people and the government and the election itself. So even if there is an election, the Egyptian people didn't go to this election because they didn't trust it. It's a history. For the Israeli, I think the history said we never attack any country. For more than 5,000 years, the enemy came to us. Whatever happened, Mubarak or not, the regime, there is some kind of constitution. There will never anything happen with Israel or any relation with Arabic country. What's happening in Egypt, it's an internal issue. The test now, and this is 48 hours, it's a landmark in the Egyptian history. The test now for Mubarak, if he keeps the security and the stability, he can continue, but not like before. The issue is, what will the West doing? The foreign country like UK and United States supported a lot of regime in the Middle East, didn't do the same development to achieve the good life for the Egyptian people. There is a growth, yes, but of economy, just one moment. But the people who benefit from this growth of the economy is just a small minority. In the same time, 40% of the population in Egypt is under 30 years. Nearly 50% unemployment. This is the real matter in Egypt. It's not about Israel. It's not about fundamentalism. It's not about anything. If you follow the news, the Egyptian youth guard and secure the Egyptian museum. They didn't like anyone to attack the history.
Okay.
Thanks.
Mindful of this problem of the alignment, you're raising the question about what other countries should consider. The alignment of countries, the European Union, the United States, and we know what President Obama did when he went there almost 2 years ago. But how we have to now recalibrate or think of recalibrating relationships based on this new reality of this pressure from the street. David Ignatius.
Well, it's fascinating to recall that a key moment of optimism about the new President Obama was his speech in Cairo. I think it was in April of 2009, which really did have an effect of arousing expectations among Egyptians and people throughout the world that this was a very different kind of American president, that he would make progress on the Arab-Israeli dispute, which he really hasn't. We've written in the Washington Post, and I think it's generally agreed that the administration after that, and his dealings with Mubarak had a fairly low-key approach where the Bush administration had pushed for democracy, a freedom agenda, really pushing for change in Egypt. The Obama administration's approach was lower key. What's been really interesting and I think significant is that over the last week, Obama and Secretary Clinton have been trying very clearly to send a message to the Egyptian public that the United States does not oppose a process of reform, encouraging Mubarak to make reforms, encouraging Mubarak not to use violent force to put down these protests. You know, you could argue that the U.S. government is attempting to catch up with this train, this accelerating train of popular unrest in Egypt and the Arab world, not to be on the wrong side of change, if you will. It's even argued that because the U.S. WikiLeaks cables had focused so much on corruption in Tunisia, that they had an effect in encouraging people to raise that issue. It was widely known among Tunisians, but the WikiLeaks cables, in a sense, reified it, made it solid, and so perhaps played an effect.
We're asked to consider normative shifts. Could we consider what is happening at the moment a normative shift when it comes to how outside governments will consider these governments where they're clearly under challenge and under threat? Are the politics of the European Union, of other countries, going to be affected, their attitude? Ernesto.
Well, this is not a new problem. This is a dilemma that governments have confronted all along. There are some principles of international law, which one of them is do not intervene in the internal affairs of other countries. And I think as a rule, that is a very fine rule. Now, more recently, however, and this is not, by the way, the case of Egypt, the international community or some sectors of the international community have come to consider as important to have another principle, and that is the responsibility to protect, right? When a government is killing its people, when it's committing genocide, then the international community has a responsibility to intervene, but that has to be done through a certain legal procedure that some principles that were discussed in 2005 at the World Summit and that would have to go through the Security Council. My point is that I think this is not a new issue. In my own country, we always had this issue. What happens when there is a coup d'etat in Chile? Well, we took the decision, even against some principles of international law, not to recognize Pinochet. And we never recognized Pinochet. We never recognized Franco. We never had diplomatic relations with them. But I think that was truly exceptional and in principle against international law.
Kishore.
You know, I'm going to inject another note of caution here, if you don't mind, Nick. You know, there is a Western perspective on global issues. The Western perspective, I always say, reflects the views of 12% of the world's population that lives in the West. 88% live outside the West, and many of them will see these things quite differently. And just to emphasize this point, it is possible that you could have a revolution on the streets, you overthrow an authoritarian government, and then you have nirvana, growth, democracy, and so on and so forth. But you could also have the Iranian-type situation. You had revolution on the streets, you overthrow a long-serving ruler, and guess what you got? So let's remember that these kinds of street revolutions can lead to negative results. And that's why you'll find that the kind of enthusiasm that you find in the Western media coverage on these events is not carried elsewhere, because they're all saying, be careful what you wish for, you may get something much worse. And let's imagine if you're Egypt's neighbors, let's imagine if you're in Israel today. The biggest geopolitical nightmare for Israel is to have the most populous Arab country at your doorstep with political instability. Believe me, it changes the whole balance in the Middle East. It makes everything else look very simple, because suddenly we go back 30 years. So be careful what you wish for, and you should in some ways ask yourself what can be done in such situations to ensure that when you make the transition from one era to another, which is always very difficult, you try to manage it carefully and not let it go off too much off the rails.
Yeah, I mean, I think a very easy false lesson to take from this week's Davos would be that it started with democracy a little bit in trouble because everybody was saying that America was gridlocked and dysfunctional, and China, without a similar democratic system, was able to make strategic long-term decisions, Then at the end of the week, we've had 1.5 revolutions by people calling for democracy. So, Kishore, we've checked you, not checkmated you, might be an easy conclusion, but I have to say I do side with David and Kishore and Ernesto in saying it ain't as simple as that.
But is it profound? What's taken place?
What is happening is profound, but the suspicion, this suggestion that it's a kind of easy, you flip aside the authoritarian state and put in place the utopian democracy, that is a very, very dangerous assumption. And I think David's point is never said enough, which is that in China you have one of the most sensitized governments anywhere to local, rural or urban protest when things are not working right, when there's local corruption or there's local income inequalities arising or party officials, overusing their position. So, we're really living in a world where you could say the profound point is sensitive, representative, inclusive government that keeps its ear to the ground and responds to popular anger, which is driven by these high rates of economic growth and potentially increased inequality, are the kind of governments that are going to make it. And the ones which and they will usually but not always be democracies, would be my point, but the ones that get ossified and formalistic and are there for too long and rely on their security forces rather than their political antennae to respond and control to people are the ones which get into trouble. And, frankly, there are some democracies which start to show some of those ossified tendencies too.
David, Martin raised the Gulf and beyond, and also Israel. Your view on that?
Well, I'd be surprised if the Gulf countries were vulnerable to these same this contagion. They just have so much more wealth. The phenomenon that I was describing before of countries that just, even with economic reforms, can't catch up to their population growth, obviously doesn't apply to Saudi Arabia or the United Arab Emirates. So although those are undemocratic regimes, I would be surprised if you saw problems there. Just to the point that Kishore is making, I agree entirely that the process of change that we're seeing is inchoate, unpredictable, potentially dangerous. I think we need to recognize what's happening and be honest about it, not be in denial about it. But I wrote this week that all revolutions seem lovable in their infancy. When there's this spontaneous sense of revolt and, that people are singing songs from Les Miserables and, on the barricades. But it's precisely because they lack leaders in the beginning that they're so easily manipulated by a revolutionary elite. I mean, that's what our history teaches us. The French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Iranian Revolution, dramatically. And I have a lot of anxiety about that process taking place today as this contagion of this flash mob of popular anger spreads. So I share that. I just think it's really important to see it for what it is, and not to be in denial, as it were, about how quickly this contagion of public unhappiness and protest can spread.
Is there anyone out there who's burning to say something at the moment on this particular issue before I broaden it out? I can't see any hands going up or anyone with a microphone. Am I correct? No. There's no one else? Fine.
Nick, on this point, this is just a footnote. Just to note that 3 members of this panel are close friends of Mohammed El-Baradei. Mark, Kishore, and I are very close friends. And here we are, the 3 of us, along with our colleagues, to say, be prudent, let the situation become clearer before. And we are we are friends of the opposition in Egypt. And we are saying, be prudent.
Let's broaden this out. David Lee, your thoughts as pundit, professor, a participant, whatever P you want to use. Just lay out a broader landscape now of where you see things changing quite significantly, or where you see direction in the next few months and years.
Again, I would be extremely cautious about what may happen in that area of the world, of which I have rather limited knowledge, frankly speaking. Now, I would like to come back to a point that Mark mentioned before. That is, democracy actually is much deeper than majority rule and voting. Is a process in which popular demand is being heard, popular demand is being responded by the government. And in this regard, I would say that perhaps one profound implication of whatever happens right now in Egypt for the rest of the world is that many governments will be very careful in listening through the internet, the tones of public opinion, and then perhaps design or implement procedures to quickly respond to certain new messages in the internet.
And trends on the world economy. Is there anything you want to add there before I go to Martin?
Well, before coming here, before our switch off for emphasis, I was going to say that 2011, at least judging from a few hours ago, should be a year of good hope for the world economy, because the major pillars of the world economy in 2011 are positioned well. They are positioned to grow very fast. The U.S. economy is now well positioned to grow more than, very conservatively, more 3%. Because of the fiscal stimulus, continued second round, I call it second round fiscal stimulus, and the QE2. And the Chinese economy will continue to grow at a pace at least 9.5%. And the CPI inflation is around 3.8. That's my best forecast. And the other big pillar of the world economy, the German economy, is also well positioned because it's able to produce goods that the emerging markets are needing. So therefore, the major parts of the world economy they are doing fine. And most fundamentally, I would emphasize that in today's world, it's very strange. We have a big creditor country, which is China, which has longer time horizon than the debtor countries, for whatever reason. And this is much better than the other way around. So when a creditor is willing to lend, to support the debtor countries to recover, and looking ahead 5 years, 10 years down the road, fundamentally, this world economy should be able to stabilize before long.
Martin.
Okay. First, a link between the two discussions. I've been one of the most interesting aspects of what's happening in these countries we've discussed, Tunisia and Egypt, is the role of technology, of modern technology in mobilizing and changing the way the population responds, and particularly the young population. I think one of the interesting parts of this, one of the reasons I enjoy coming to Davos is talking to people in areas I don't write about regularly, don't think about regularly, and one of them is obviously technology. And every year I come away, and it's even more obvious now on how profoundly the world is being changed and will continue to be changed by this. This is incredibly important, not just because, of course, of the way we live and the politics, but it's an underlying engine. It's one of the two great underlying engines of world economic growth, and it's continuing to function. Very important to stress. The second great underlying engine of economic growth, which is clearly emphasized by what we've heard here, is what I called, I'm not saying that I coined this, maybe somebody else, the great convergence, which is a reversal of what was been written by a book, the title of a book by Ken Pomerantz, at the University of California, called The Great Divergence, which discussed what happened in the 19th century when the West rose to the level of preeminent power, which Kishore was just discussing. This is ending, and it is ending with a simply staggering speed. Simply staggering speed. The change in the relative economic weight of the developed West against the dominant emerging world in general, but above all, of course, of China, has simply no historical precedent, and I see no reason to expect that to change in the next 5 to 10 years. Thereafter, actually, what happens to China gets very interesting. The third point I would make, and that has immense ramifications everywhere. Everything we talk about, resources, resource prices, shifts in the global conversation on who is important and who isn't, and let me just indicate a couple of implications of this. One of the discussions, one of the points that came out, which David emphasized, what is special about this? Well, one of the things that's really special about this, unprecedented, is we have the fastest growing country in the world, a relatively poor country, which is also the world's largest creditor. That's a completely unprecedented combination. And one of the interesting questions I've been thinking about in the last few weeks is, well, what is China going to want the international financial system to be like from its point of view? And it seems to me pretty clear that one of the things that we won't want to discuss in the West, that China is going to want, they're not saying this so clearly now, is we will want to stop the hot money. The Chinese don't like the hot money. They really don't like the hot money. And I expect they'll be very bashful, it'll be very slow, but at some point we're going to have a Chinese agenda on what to do about this. And incidentally, almost all the emerging countries will agree on that. They don't like Chinese exchange rate policy, but they will agree on this. We won't necessarily be able to run the agenda on the way the financial sector operates for very much longer. At the moment, the Chinese are really just trying to protect themselves from our financial sector, but they hate it. Now, I think, this is a challenge to David, because I think he'll disagree, but that's my view, and the Chinese will have the power to really influence this. And the last area, and I could mention others, where I think we really are in a different world is the way resources are going to be managed. It's already pretty clear that China is incredibly concerned about access to resources, investment in resources. The pressure on the world's resources that is created by 10% growth, continuing year after year after year in China and India, is extraordinary. the pressure we're seeing on prices, this is not some result of monetary policy. Anybody who thinks that what's happening to the price of resources because Ben Bernanke is printing money is completely lunatic. Completely lunatic. So I just want to emphasize that I haven't talked about the short-term problems, which are obvious. We are moving into a new world. We don't understand this new world. The combination of technology with the rise, the great convergence makes this a new world. And this is not temporary. This is permanent.
Right. I'll invite all of you in the last 10 minutes to pick up whatever you want or lay other things onto the agenda. I come to you, Kishore, not just because you put up your hand, but because earlier this week you wrote an op-ed in the Financial Times describing yourself as a relatively rude Asian by setting forward a number of new realities which the West has to understand.
Well, I was actually going to inject some good news and some optimism.
But you did describe yourself
into the
in that
discussion.
way, didn't you?
But yes, I mean, let me first of all emphasize the good news, okay? If you look at it against the larger sweep of history in the last 60, 70 years or so, my prediction is that the next 10 years will be among the best years in human history. Why? One, we can be reasonably confident that no major wars will take place between any two major powers. That's a big historical shift. There'll be proxy wars, there'll be civil wars, but there'll be no major wars. And to say that confidently of any period of human history would be very difficult. Secondly, in terms of the number of people in the world who are going to benefit from economic growth, it'll be the highest you've ever seen in human history. In terms of numbers of people entering the middle classes, all you need in Asia is a 10% growth in median income, which is easily established to get a doubling of the middle classes. And that's what you're going to see happening throughout Asia. So the broader sweep of history is going to be massively positive. But at the same time, you have to adjust to power shifts, and I'm glad that Martin highlighted it, because the point I make, which is the uncomfortable point I make as a rude Asian, is that the last 200 years of Western domination of world history has been basically a major historical aberration. And all historical aberrations come to a natural end, and you will see that happening too. But I do think that the shift of power from the West to the East can take place peacefully if Western policymakers are prepared to say, okay, let's change the rules of the international game. Let's not have the rule that says to become the head of the IMF, you must be European. To become the head of the World Bank, you must be an American. Open it up to everybody, and Asians can also qualify. So these are the changes, I think, that can be made. So I want to emphasize that actually the good times are coming.
David, just pick up what Martin challenged you on.
Let me say that I don't think any Chinese policymakers and seriously minded academics from China know what kind of system China needs, whether it's world trade or international monetary system or international finance system, because it's so complicated, seriously speaking. I'm completely honest. However, most people in China do know two things. Number one, China being the largest creditor country in the world has a huge, I guess the largest, arguably the largest amount of stake in the smooth working of the current international monetary system, and perhaps even enlarging it to financial system. The $3 trillion amount of currency reserves, including our investment overseas CIC, is perhaps arguably the biggest bonding effect, represents the biggest bonding effect between China and the current world economic system. That is one thing we do know. We do not want to see any short-term disruption in the working of the current system. On this, I think there's a maximum amount of room for collaboration between the Chinese decision makers and the rest of the world. Second thing we do know, that there are fundamental problems, fundamental defects. Whatever we say here, whatever French president said in this podium, are shared by the policymakers, academics in China. However, we don't know how to reform it, what kind of destination we want. And people are willing to come here and other fora to discuss, to work together.
David, your big thought, your big prediction, and maybe you can just embrace in that whether the new Republican-led House in Washington and the Tea Party understand what we're hearing, particularly about the shift of power.
I'm going to leave the last part of that alone because I really, as little as I understand what President Mubarak is going to do, I understand less what the Tea Party will do.
David, you avoiding a question. I can't believe that. No, but is there literally nothing you can add on that about the sensitivity in D.C. and across America to this new reality?
I think Americans understand that this is a world that's changing and that we've seen the limits of American power, economic power, military power. Every day we see in Afghanistan a demonstration of the limits of this enormous military power that the United States has built up. And so I think for everyone in Washington who thinks about policy, there's the question of how this still very powerful, very wealthy country recovering pretty well, as Tim Geithner has been reminding us this week from a steep decline, how we can influence events around the world in a positive way. I was at the White House State Dinner for Hu Jintao a week ago, and I was struck by what a constructive meeting that was. It spoke to China and the world about a relationship, but with a kind of social grace, and that's what superpowers should do. I'm struck by how the president this week, today, is trying to use the instruments of communication, understanding that he can't determine what happens in Egypt, but trying to do what he can to shape it in directions that are least threatening to U.S. interests and also, in his judgment, best for the Egyptian people. But I think my baseline for the period we're entering, for better or worse, and there'll be some of both, is that we're seeing the limits of U.S. power to shape events. That doesn't mean that we're powerless. Smart power, as Joe and I likes to say, can have significant effect. But the Egyptian person in the street who's out protesting, I'm just certain one of the things that shapes the way he looks at the world is, I'm going to quote Ayatollah Khomeini in 1978 and 79. America can't do a damn thing. It was a famous slogan of the revolution. It was this recognition that this super powerful country far away couldn't stop events. And I think people understand that now in a new way, and it's part of this new reality.
Before I go to Ernesto and finally Mark, let me just question you, though, just press you a little bit on that. The new quadrennial policy review at the State Department saying there's got to be a shift from kinetic power, the use of military force, to what Joe calls soft power, citizen power, a new form of diplomacy across the agencies. Hillary Clinton believes she's now got buy-in. Do you believe that is going to be the new America? Less hard power, more diplomacy and citizen power?
I think there's no question that our enormous defense budget and the spending for what I would call legacy systems, the symbols of American power, the aircraft carriers, the squadrons of jets, that spending is just going to have to go down. This is an entirely different subject, but I think we're at the hinge of quite new and disruptive technologies in warfare. We've talked about communications technologies, but as directed energy weapons, as exotic cyber weapons come into play, the systems we've built and on which we've depended for power suddenly become, I don't want to say obsolete, but a lot less efficacious. And people are trying to figure out what that means. So there are a series of changes. Every time I say that we're going to do more with the State Department, the Pentagon ends up doing more of what the State Department should be doing because it's got the resources. But no question people are thinking about that.
Ernesto, your big thought, your big prediction for...
Well, I want to be as optimistic as Kishore. At the same time, I want to emphasize the importance of what Martin said. I mean, there is a rebalancing, economic and political, and I would say military, in the world. But this is indeed a great time of opportunity, a great time of potential of prosperity. But the biggest step that has to be made among leaders, among societies, among governments, among civil society organizations, is to recognize what is the consequence of being as interdependent as we have become. And I would say for the better, for the much better, thanks to this globalization and otherwise. Well, the consequence is that every one of our countries will have to be willing to give up sovereignty in order to pursue the solution of problems that cannot be solved by one country alone, no matter how powerful that country is. And I think this is the big risk that we are facing. If we don't have that vision, if we don't have that leadership, at least to deliver what has been promised, like the G20 said, we are going to fix the global imbalances. And so far, although the global imbalances have become down because of the recession, structurally they are there and they will explode rather sooner than later. The leader said we are going to finish the Doha round, and it was like a joke. The leaders have made many promises about how to improve the international system, and they haven't delivered. I have spent the last few years of my life working with some people also here looking at multilateral institutions. It is not that they are bad per se. It is because they have not received sufficient attention, resources, and political support. And those institutions need to be improved. And yet, on the ground, on the territory of political will and support, nothing meaningful is happening. So here we have a problem that we are enjoying this opportunity because of interdependence, but we are unable to organize ourselves to provide that solution to problems that cannot be addressed but through common collective action. And that, I think, is the big challenge. My guess is if we see some progress in this area, then perhaps Kishore is right. We are on the eve of another great decade or many decades of prosperity and even more peaceful world.
Ernesto, thank you. Mark, finally to you, let me just put, do you think many of the countries you've been dealing with in your professional career in Africa and the developing world, both as a minister and at the World Bank and the UN, will reflect on a staggering pace of change and them benefiting, and the 10 years, the best 10 years in human history, are they going to benefit, do you think?
Well, I mean, I think Africa is, every Davos, its presence here is properly bigger, it's more attractive, interesting. It's in some ways an Asia of 20 years ago, starting to get some high growth rates, some early wins, et cetera, et cetera. But I think just, two closing points which bear on that. One is to build on what Ernesto said. I mean, we all sort of slightly discount multilateral institutions as tired, jaded, past it. We're actually at one of those equilibrium points, whereas the US recognizes it can't run the world alone, and as China doesn't want to take the responsibility of either running it itself or sharing that responsibility directly with the US, we're reaching that point like 1945 when people want to kind of distribute the responsibility. That is essentially why Franklin Roosevelt created the United Nations. We're coming back to that similar moment where you have a dispersion of power which requires multilateral institutions. The second, of course, related point is it's at a time of much greater global integration and interdependence around so many issues. So prediction one, expect a sudden revival of multilateralism. Prediction two, I completely agree with Kishore's prospects for Asia, but I am actually slightly worried about the next 10 years. I think some of these consequences of growth, environmental problems, inequalities in some Asian countries, unresolved border disputes, which remind one of early 20th century Europe, an aging population in China, which has depended on the economic advantage of a young population till now. But remember the impact of a one-child family policy, what that means over as those one children, as parents all retire, has created a situation where I have no doubt about the long-term prediction for Asia, but I wonder whether over the next few years we won't be giving a little bit more attention to Africa and Latin America, and sometimes when we come here, not just talking of the Asian success, but confronting quite a few Asian problems on the road to that success.
Pundits, professors and practitioners, the predictions. You won't be held to anything of what you've said, but thank you very much indeed for at least laying out your vision of the landscape for the next few hours, few days, few weeks, few months. All of you, thank you.